They prepared the trap disguised as a simple question, cameras zooming in to capture her expected mistake. Her elegant response revealed the question's true intent, leaving the reporter's tactics exposed for all to see. A seasoned journalist thought he could trap Melania Trump, but her unexpected response silenced the entire press room, leaving him completely speechless. What happened next changed everything. The grand ballroom of the Ellington Hotel glittered with carefully crafted opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, casting warm light across marble floors. Fresh flowers adorned every table, their subtle fragrance mingling with expensive perfumes and aftershaves. The Children, First Foundation's annual gala, was in full swing, an event that typically garnered modest media attention. But tonight was different. Tonight, Melania Trump was the guest of honor. Her involvement with the children's charity had been ongoing for years, long before and after her time as First Lady. But her public appearances remained rare, calculated, measured, always on her own terms. The press section was larger than usual. A row of journalists lined the back wall, some genuinely covering the charity's work, others hoping for a moment, a soundbite, anything that might generate clicks. Among them stood Jason Reynolds, tall, slim, impeccably dressed, a press badge from the Daily Circuit hanging around his neck. His reputation preceded him, a journalist known for crafting questions like her carefully disguised traps, especially for conservative figures. He had built his career on viral moments, politicians stumbling over their words, caught in contradictions, made to look foolish or extreme. His social media followers lived for these clips, shared them, celebrated them as victories in an ongoing culture war. Tonight, his sights were set on Melania. He'd spent days preparing his approach, studying her previous responses, identifying the perfect pressure points. To him, this wasn't just another assignment. It was an opportunity to create a moment that would circulate for days, boost his profile, elevate his brand. Across the room, event organizers nervously watched the growing media presence. This was supposed to be about the children, about raising funds for educational programs, not political theater, but they knew the reality. The moment they'd secured Melania as honoree, the dynamic had changed. Charlotte Wilson, the foundation's director, approached the small stage at the front of the room, tapping the microphone gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The crowd quieted gradually, conversations fading to whispers, then to silence. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support the Children the First Foundation." She gestured toward elegantly dressed tables where donors sat with checkbooks ready. "Your generosity makes our work possible, allowing us to reach over 15,000 children in underserved communities last year alone." Polite applause rippled through the room. "Tonight, we're honored to recognize someone whose commitment to children's welfare has been both substantial and sustained." Cameras raised, lenses focused. "Please welcome our honoree, Mrs. Melania Trump." The applause was immediate, if somewhat divided, enthusiastic from some corners, perfunctory from others. Melania rose from her table, the spotlight finding her immediately. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant, understated. Her expression composed but warm as she walked to the stage. Every eye in the room followed, some with admiration, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. Reynolds straightened his posture, fingers tightening around his recorder, eyes narrowed slightly in concentration. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Melania took her position at the podium, thanking Charlotte with a warm smile before turning to address the room. "Thank you for this recognition, though the real acknowledgement should go to the dedicated staff and volunteers of the Children First Foundation." Her accent still present, but her words clear, measured, thoughtful. "Children deserve our protection, our support, our guidance, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of politics." She continued speaking about the foundation's work, highlighting specific programs, sharing stories of children whose lives had been impacted by educational opportunities, her passion for the cause evident in the slight softening of her voice when she spoke of individual success stories. The room listened, some with surprise at her eloquence, others with grudging respect for her obvious commitment to the cause. Reynolds barely heard the speech. He was too busy mentally rehearsing his question, fine-tuning the wording, imagining the reaction, the inevitable viral clip that would follow. As Melania, They prepared the trap disguised as a simple question, camera zooming in to capture her expected mistake. Her elegant response revealed the question's true intent, leaving the reporter's tactics exposed for all to see. A seasoned journalist thought he could trap Melania Trump, but her unexpected response silenced the entire press room, leaving him completely speechless. What happened next changed everything. The grand ballroom of the Ellington Hotel glittered with carefully crafted opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, casting warm light across marble floors. Fresh flowers adorned every table, their subtle fragrance mingling with expensive perfumes and aftershaves. The Children, First Foundation's annual gala, was in full swing, an event that typically garnered modest media attention. But tonight was different. Tonight, Melania Trump was the guest of honor. Her involvement with the children's charity had been ongoing for years, long before and after her time as First Lady. But her public appearances remained rare, calculated, measured, always on her own terms. The press section was larger than usual. A row of journalists lined the back wall, some genuinely covering the charity's work, others hoping for a moment, a soundbite, anything that might generate clicks. Among them stood Jason Reynolds, tall, slim, impeccably dressed, a press badge from the Daily Circuit hanging around his neck. His reputation preceded him, a journalist known for crafting questions like her carefully disguised traps, especially for conservative figures. He had built his career on viral moments, politicians stumbling over their words, caught in contradictions, made to look foolish or extreme. His social media followers lived for these clips, shared them, celebrated them as victories in an ongoing culture war. Tonight, his sights were set on Melania. He'd spent days preparing his approach, studying her previous responses, identifying the perfect pressure points. To him, this wasn't just another assignment. It was an opportunity to create a moment that would circulate for days, boost his profile, elevate his brand. Across the room, event organizers nervously watched the growing media presence. This was supposed to be about the children, about raising funds for educational programs, not political theater, but they knew the reality. The moment they'd secured Melania as honoree, the dynamic had changed. Charlotte Wilson, the foundation's director, approached the small stage at the front of the room, tapping the microphone gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The crowd quieted gradually, conversations fading to whispers, then to silence. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support the Children the First Foundation." She gestured toward elegantly dressed tables where donors sat with checkbooks ready. "Your generosity makes our work possible, allowing us to reach over 15,000 children in underserved communities last year alone." Polite applause rippled through the room. "Tonight, we're honored to recognize someone whose commitment to children's welfare has been both substantial and sustained." Cameras raised, lenses focused. "Please welcome our honoree, Mrs. Melania Trump." The applause was immediate, if somewhat divided, enthusiastic from some corners, perfunctory from others. Melania rose from her table, the spotlight finding her immediately. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant, understated. Her expression composed but warm as she walked to the stage. Every eye in the room followed, some with admiration, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. Reynolds straightened his posture, fingers tightening around his recorder, eyes narrowed slightly in concentration. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Melania took her position at the podium, thanking Charlotte with a warm smile before turning to address the room. "Thank you for this recognition, though the real acknowledgement should go to the dedicated staff and volunteers of the Children First Foundation." Her accent still present, but her words clear, measured, thoughtful. "Children deserve our protection, our support, our guidance, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of politics." She continued speaking about the foundation's work, highlighting specific programs, sharing stories of children whose lives had been impacted by educational opportunities, her passion for the cause evident in the slight softening of her voice when she spoke of individual success stories. The room listened, some with surprise at her eloquence, others with grudging respect for her obvious commitment to the cause. Reynolds barely heard the speech. He was too busy mentally rehearsing his question, fine-tuning the wording, imagining the reaction, the inevitable viral clip that would follow. As Melania, Concluded her brief remarks, Charlotte returned to the stage. Mrs. Trump has generously agreed to take a few questions about the Foundation's work. This was unexpected. Melania rarely entertained unscripted questions. Hands shot up immediately. Charlotte pointed to a woman near the front. "Mrs. Trump, how did you first become involved with the Children First Foundation?" "A softball question," Melania answered easily, sharing a story about visiting one of their programs years before her husband entered politics. Another question followed, equally benign, about specific initiatives she found most effective. Reynolds remained patient, his hand raised continuously. Waiting for his opening, Charlotte scanned the room, hesitating slightly when she noticed Reynolds, his reputation well known, but ignoring him would seem deliberate, political, exactly what the Foundation was trying to avoid. Reluctantly, she nodded in his direction. "The gentleman in the back, from the Daily Circuit." Reynolds straightened, a slight smile playing at his lips as he rose to his full height. Camera phones shifted in his direction, the room sensing something was about to happen. "Mrs. Trump, thank you for your work with the charity." His tone polite, respectful, the perfect disguise for what was coming. "I'm curious, though, given your husband's policies on immigrant children and your own immigrant background, how do you reconcile supporting this foundation while staying silent on policies that many say harmed the very children you claim to care about?" The question hung in the air, charged with accusation. Several guests inhaled sharply. Charlotte stepped forward, clearly ready to intervene, to remind everyone that political questions were not the purpose of this event. But Melania gently raised her hand, stopping Charlotte's approach. Her expression remained unchanged, composed, unreadable. Reynolds stood with microphone still raised, the perfect picture of journalistic inquiry. But the glint in his eyes revealed something else, satisfaction at having delivered his carefully crafted trap. Photographers raised their cameras, sensing a moment. Other journalists leaned forward, notebooks ready, waiting for her to stumble, to grow defensive, to provide the reaction that would feed tomorrow's headlines. But what happened next was something no one in that room had anticipated, something that would leave Reynolds and everyone else present completely reevaluating their assumptions about the former First Lady. Because sometimes the most powerful responses aren't the ones we rehearse, but the ones that come from a place of unexpected truth. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, though in reality it was only seconds. Melania stood at the podium, her posture unchanged, her expression revealing nothing of the thoughts behind her eyes. Reynolds maintained his position, microphone still raised, a small smile playing at his lips, certain he had accomplished his goal. But something in the room had shifted. The air felt different, charged with anticipation as everyone waited for her response. Charlotte Wilson shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between intervening and allowing Melania to handle the situation. Several Foundation board members exchanged nervous glances. This was exactly the scenario they had hoped to avoid. Politics infiltrating a charitable event, threatening to overshadow the work they had gathered to support. But Melania herself seemed unruffled. She took a small breath, adjusted the microphone slightly, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, neither defensive nor angry. "Mr. Reynolds, I believe we've met before," not what anyone expected her to say. Reynolds blinked, surprised that she remembered him from a brief White House press event years earlier. "Yes, at the Children's Hospital Initiative," he responded automatically. "You asked a similar question then," Melania noted, "about how I reconcile different aspects of my life and beliefs." Several reporters began writing furiously. This was already not following the anticipated script. "I notice your question assumes that caring about children must be conditional, based on politics, policies, circumstances of birth," she continued, her accent more pronounced, but her words precise. "Perhaps this is where we differ." A slight murmur rippled through the room. Reynolds shifted his weight, the first hint of uncertainty crossing his expression. He had expected anger, defensiveness, or a vague non-answer, not this direct engagement. "Mrs. Trump, with respect," he tried to regain control. The policies were specific and documented, separating children from parents at the border, cutting funding for international children's programs. These directly contradict the values you're promoting tonight. His voice had an edge now, sharper, less disguised. Several guests nodded in agreement, others frowned at the confrontational tone in a charity setting. Melania listened, actually listened, not just waiting for her chance to respond. When she spoke again, her voice remained even, but carried a new intensity that commanded attention. "Let me tell you something about my understanding of advocacy," she began, her hands resting lightly on the podium. "I grew up in a country where speaking against government policy could destroy not just your life, but your family's as well." The room stilled. Her reference to her childhood in communist Yugoslavia was not something she often discussed publicly. "I learned early that public confrontation is not the only form of influence, nor always the most effective." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "During my time in the White House, I had many private conversations, advocated for changes in approaches, some you saw, some you didn't." Reynolds opened his mouth to interrupt, but Melania continued, her rhythm unbroken. "The foundation we're supporting tonight helps children regardless of their immigration status, their parents' politics, or whether they fit neatly into someone's political narrative." A woman at a front table nodded silently. Others throughout the room seemed surprised, both by her willingness to address the question and the eloquence with which she did so. "I've visited detention facilities, met with separated families, sat with children while cameras weren't allowed. Not because it created good headlines, but because they deserve to be seen as children first, not political symbols." Reynolds shifted again, his prepared follow-up suddenly seeming inadequate, faced with an answer that didn't fit his expectations. "But you never publicly denounced," he tried again. "Not all advocacy is performed for cameras," Melania interrupted gently but firmly. "Sometimes the most meaningful work happens in rooms where no journalists are present, where no tweets are composed, where the only measure of success is whether it helped a child." Charlotte Wilson was watching wide-eyed, along with everyone else in the ballroom. This was not the simple charity speech they had anticipated. "The question you're really asking," Melania continued, her gaze steady, "is why I didn't publicly criticize my husband, why I didn't perform my disagreements for public consumption." She looked directly at Reynolds now. Would that have helped a single child? Or would it have simply satisfied those who believe marriage should be sacrificed on the altar of political performance? A silence fell over the room, heavy with the weight of her question. Some guests looked down at their tables. Others watched Reynolds, waiting for his response. But for perhaps the first time in his career, the reporter seemed temporarily at a loss for words. "The children we're here to support tonight deserve more than to be used as leverage in political arguments," Melania continued, her voice softening slightly. "They deserve our attention, our resources, our commitment, without conditionality." She glanced around the room, making brief eye contact with donors, with foundation staff, with the few children present who were watching with curious expressions. "So, to answer your question directly, I reconcile my support for all children by actually supporting all children, not just when it's politically convenient, not just when cameras are present, and not just when it aligns with a particular narrative." She gestured toward the foundation display, where photos of children from diverse backgrounds showcase the organization's work. "That's what tonight is about, not politics, not headlines, but children whose lives can be transformed through opportunity." The room was completely silent now. Reynolds stood, microphone still in hand, but his confident posture had faded, replaced by something less certain, less assured. A photographer captured the moment, the composed former First Lady, the suddenly off-balance reporter, the captivated audience. It wasn't the image Reynolds had come for, but it was the one that would circulate tomorrow. "Now," Melania said with a warm smile, turning to Charlotte, "I believe we have time for one more question, perhaps from someone interested in discussing the Foundation's actual work." The subtle redirection was masterful, not angry, not defensive, but firmly returning the focus to the purpose of the evening. Charlotte quickly nodded, pointing to another journalist, a woman from a local paper known for community reporting. "Could you tell us more about the mentorship program you mentioned and how it specifically helps children overcome educational barriers?" As Melania answered, discussing the details of the program with genuine enthusiasm and knowledge, Reynolds slowly lowered his microphone, his expression a mixture of emotions. Frustration, certainly, but also something else, something that looked almost like reluctant respect. He had come for a soundbite, a moment of gotcha journalism. Instead, he had received a lesson in dignity, composure, and the quiet power of refusing to play by someone else's rules. Around the room, phones were already lighting up. As attendees discreetly messaged friends, posted on social media, shared what they had just witnessed. Melania Trump schools reporter, unexpected eloquence from former First Lady. Reporters' attempt to ambush Melania backfires. The headlines were writing themselves, but the real story, the one that wasn't captured in pithy social media posts, was the subtle shift that had occurred in how people in that room were looking at a woman many thought they had already figured out. Because sometimes, the most powerful response to provocation isn't anger or defensiveness, but a dignity so unexpected it forces everyone to reconsider the narratives they've accepted without question. As Melania finished answering the final question about the Foundation's mentorship program, Charlotte Wilson stepped forward, smoothly bringing the Q&A to a close. "Thank you, Mrs. Trump, for your time and thoughtful responses," she gestured toward the room. "And thank you all for your support tonight. The real beneficiaries are the children whose lives will be changed through your generosity." Polite applause filled the ballroom, but the energy had shifted, conversations already beginning in hushed tones throughout the room. Reynolds stood motionless, his recorder still in hand but no longer raised, his expression unreadable as the formal portion of the event concluded. Guests began to mingle. Some approached Melania, offering congratulations, thanks for her candor. Others clustered in small groups, discussing what they had witnessed. A moment that had defied expectations on all sides. In one corner, a group of journalists huddled together. Reynolds conspicuously absent. "Did you get that on camera?" One whispered urgently. Every second, another replied, "This isn't the clip I expected to file tonight." A third admitted checking his notes. She completely flipped the script. Away from the crowd, Reynolds stood near the exit, scrolling through his phone, notifications already pouring in from his editor, from colleagues, from social media followers. The narrative forming in real time was not the one he had anticipated. Reynolds gets schooled by Melania Trump. Former First Lady elegantly shuts down gotcha question. When political ambush backfires, he slipped his phone into his pocket, jaw tightening slightly. "Jason," a voice called. He turned to find Elise Chen, a respected journalist from a competing outlet, approaching with an expression that mixed sympathy with something else, something that looked almost like amusement. "Tough break," she said quietly, falling into step beside him. "I don't know what you mean," Reynolds replied stiffly. "I asked a legitimate question. She gave an answer." Elise raised an eyebrow. "We both know what you were trying to do," she said, her voice low. "The same thing we've all done at some point, craft the perfect gotcha moment, the viral clip that boosts our profile." She glanced across the room where Melania was speaking with a young girl who had presented her with a thank you card. But sometimes the subjects of our clever traps turn out to be more complex than our narratives allow. Reynolds didn't respond, his gaze following Elise's, watching as Melania knelt slightly to be at eye level with the child, listening with genuine attention to whatever the girl was saying. "The thing is," Elise continued, "what just happened in there, that's actually a better story than the one you came for." She tapped his shoulder lightly. "Just something to consider when you file tonight." She walked away, leaving Reynolds alone with thoughts he wasn't ready to examine. Across the room, Charlotte approached Melania, anxiety etched across her features. "Mrs. Trump, I am so sorry about that inappropriate question. It was never our intention." Melania gently touched her arm, stopping the apology mid-sentence. "There's no need," she said simply. "Questions don't offend me, only the assumption that I haven't considered them myself." Charlotte nodded, grateful for the gracious response. "The event has already raised 30% more than last year," she said, changing the subject. "Your presence made a real difference," Melania smiled. "That's what matters." As the evening continued, Reynolds found himself unable to leave as planned, instead watching from a distance as Melania navigated the room, stopping to speak with donors, foundation staff, the children present. There was something in her manner that contradicted the caricature he had accepted without question, the narrative of the disengaged trophy wife, the reluctant First Lady counting the minutes until freedom. Instead, he saw someone comfortable in this environment, knowledgeable about the cause, connecting with people individually without cameras documenting every interaction. His phone buzzed again, his editor this time, not a text, but a call. Reluctantly, he answered, stepping into a quiet hallway. "Please tell me you got that entire exchange," his editor said, without preamble. "Every word," Reynolds confirmed. "But Dave, it's not the story we discussed." "It's better," his editor interrupted. Everyone expected another hit piece on a Trump. What no one expected was her response. "That's the story now." Reynolds frowned. "So, you want me to write about how she handled my question?" "I want you to write what happened," Dave replied. A journalist asked a loaded question expecting a defensive response, and instead received a thoughtful answer that challenged assumptions on all sides. A waiter passed by with empty glasses, nodding politely at Reynolds, who barely noticed, too focused on the conversation. "That's not usually our angle," he said carefully. Our readers expect journalism," Dave cut in, his voice firmer now. "Sometimes that means confirming existing narratives. Sometimes it means challenging them. Tonight, it means the latter." Reynolds was silent for a moment, processing this unexpected direction. "The clicks will be there either way," Dave added pragmatically, "but integrity might actually get us more." After hanging up, Reynolds leaned against the wall, replaying the exchange in his mind, analyzing where his strategy had failed, or, perhaps more accurately, where his assumptions had been flawed. He had approached the situation with absolute certainty that he understood who Melania Trump was, what she believed, how she would react. That certainty had been his first mistake. Back in the ballroom, the event was winding down, guests beginning to depart with final handshakes, congratulations, promises of continued support. Melania prepared to leave as well, her security detail moving into position. Discreetly scanning the room as they guided her toward the exit, she paused briefly, noticing Reynolds still present. Their eyes met across the room, a moment of recognition, but not animosity. She gave a small nod, neither confrontational nor submissive, simply acknowledging that something unexpected had transpired between them. Reynolds found himself nodding back, an unspoken exchange that contained more nuance than their public confrontation. Then she was gone, escorted through a side exit, away from waiting photographers. The room felt different in her absence, guests continuing to discuss what they had witnessed, a moment that had transcended the usual political theater. Reynolds pulled out his notebook, staring at the questions he had prepared, the follow-ups he had crafted, designed to corner, not illuminate, to expose, not understand. He turned to a fresh page and began to write something different, something he hadn't planned, something about assumptions and complexity, about performance versus purpose, about how the most revealing moments often come when our certainties are challenged. Outside the hotel, media had gathered, hoping to catch Melania's departure, get a comment, a soundbite, anything to supplement their coverage, but her car was already pulling away, leaving them with nothing but secondhand accounts and their own preconceptions to shape their stories. Inside, Reynolds continued writing, words flowing in unexpected directions, forcing him to confront not just what had happened tonight, but his own role in the ecosystem that reduced complex individuals to simple caricatures, easy to attack, easy to dismiss. His phone continued buzzing, social media still erupting with clips, opinions, hot takes, each claiming to know exactly what had transpired, what it meant, who had won, who had lost. The familiar binary framing that left no room for nuance. But something had shifted for Reynolds, a crack in the certainty that had defined his approach to journalism, politics, people, especially those who occupied the opposing side of the cultural divide. It wasn't a complete transformation, no road to Damascus moment, just a small questioning of narratives previously accepted without hesitation. And sometimes that's where the most important journeys begin, not in dramatic revelations, but in quiet moments of doubt that open doors to more complex understandings than our certainties allow. By morning, the exchange had spread beyond the usual political echo chambers, clips circulating across platforms, transcripts analyzed, reactions pouring in from unexpected quarters. Reynolds woke to a notification storm, hundreds of comments, shares, mentions, tags, some attacking him for the attempted ambush, others praising him for asking the hard questions. But most surprising were those from his own side of the political spectrum, questioning the approach, the assumptions, the reduction of complex individuals to convenient caricatures. His article had posted at midnight, not the takedown he had planned, but something more nuanced, exploring how prepared narratives sometimes collapse when confronted with unexpected authenticity. His editor had pushed it to the front page, an unusual position for a piece that didn't neatly reinforce the outlet's typical perspective. He scrolled through reader comments, saw the confusion, anger, appreciation, a microcosm of the divided reactions playing out across the media landscape. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously. "Reynolds?" "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds." The voice was familiar but unexpected. Charlotte Wilson from the Children First Foundation. "I hope I'm not calling too early." Reynolds checked the time, 7:15 a.m. "No, it's fine." He sat up in bed. "What can I do for you, Ms. Wilson?" There was a slight hesitation. "I've read your article about last night." Another pause. "It wasn't what I expected," Reynolds laughed softly. "That seems to be the theme lately." "The Foundation Board is meeting this morning," she continued. "We're discussing our media strategy moving forward." Reynolds waited, sensing there was more. "We'd like to invite you to tour one of our facilities, see the work firsthand before our next major event." The invitation was clearly significant, extending trust rather than restriction after what had transpired. "May I ask why me specifically?" Reynolds couldn't help asking. Charlotte's response was measured. "Because you were willing to reconsider your own narrative. That's rare in journalism today, especially political journalism." After the call ended, Reynolds sat motionless, staring at the wall of his apartment. The invitation represented something beyond professional opportunity. It was a chance to see beyond the simplified narratives he had trafficked in for years. His phone buzzed again, a text from his editor. "Morning Show wants you to discuss last night in your article. Can you be at the studio by 9? Television appearances were currency in modern journalism, especially national morning shows with millions of viewers. But Reynolds hesitated, knowing what they would want from him. Conflict, drama, controversy. The usual framing that reduced complex situations to entertaining spectacle. "What's the angle?" he texted back. The response came quickly. "Journalists such as Melania, who won, who lost, the usual." Reynolds stared at the message, feeling something shift inside him. "I don't think that's the story," he replied finally. "Shocking, I know," he added with a hint of self-awareness. Across town, at a discreet luxury hotel, Melania was having breakfast when her assistant entered with a tablet. "Good morning, Mrs. Trump. I thought you might want to see this." She placed the device on the table, opened a Reynolds article. The headline wasn't sensational, no clickbait, no accusations, simply, "When narratives collapse, a journalist reconsiders assumptions about Melania." Trump. Melania took the tablet, reading quietly, her expression revealing nothing as her assistant waited. "Interesting," she said finally, handing the tablet back. "He's more thoughtful than I expected." Her assistant nodded. "The piece is being widely shared across political lines, which is unusual these days." Melania sipped her tea. "Perhaps because it acknowledges complexity, something increasingly rare in how we discuss each other." Her assistant hesitated, then added, "Several major networks have requested interviews to discuss what happened last night." Melania smiled slightly. "I'm sure they have, but they both knew she would decline these invitations. The Foundation's work was the priority, not the media's desire for confrontational spectacle." Her phone chimed softly, a message from the Foundation thanking her for handling a difficult situation with grace and informing her that donations had surged overnight. That was the outcome that mattered, not the viral clips, not the analyses, but the tangible support for children who needed it. Across the city, in television studios, newsrooms, social media, companies, the story continued to evolve, each outlet framing it according to their perspective. Melania Trump silences liberal reporter. Former First Lady deflects accountability questions. Unexpected moment of grace in polarized time. On a popular morning show, a panel of commentators debated the significance of the exchange. "What struck me," said a conservative analyst, "wasn't just what Mrs. Trump said, but how she redirected the conversation back to the children, the actual purpose of the event." A liberal counterpart nodded, surprising the host. "I have to agree. Whatever your politics, there was something refreshing about a public figure responding with substance rather than defensiveness or attack." The host seemed disappointed by this unexpected consensus, quickly steering the conversation back toward more divisive aspects. In his apartment, Reynolds declined the TV appearance, choosing instead to continue writing, exploring something that had been gnawing at him since the previous night, the ecosystem of certainty that journalism had become, where reporters arrived at events with stories already written. questions designed not to illuminate, but to confirm existing narratives. His editor called, concerned, "You're turning down national exposure? That's not like you." Reynolds sighed. "I know, but I'm working on something I think matters more." "More than career advancement?" his editor asked, skeptical. "Maybe," Reynolds admitted. "I'm still figuring that out." Later that morning, he found himself at a small coffee shop near one of the Foundation's youth centers, laptop open, notes spread out, trying to articulate something that had been just beyond his grasp, about the nature of public discourse, the reduction of complex individuals to simplified villains or heroes based on political affiliation. "Is this seat taken?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Elise Chen, the journalist who had spoken to him after the event. "Please," he gestured to the empty chair. She sat, placing her own coffee on the table between them. "So," she said, studying him, "that was quite an article, not what the Daily Circuit usually publishes." Reynolds shrugged. "Not what I usually write." "That's what made it interesting," she replied. "A journalist acknowledging the collapse of his own narrative instead of doubling down. That's practically revolutionary these days." Reynolds laughed despite himself. "Don't exaggerate. It was just one article." Elise shook her head. "It was more than that. It was a crack in the certainty that drives most political coverage." She gestured toward his notes. "What are you working on now?" He hesitated, then answered honestly, "Something about how we approach people, especially public figures, with stories already written, narratives already decided. Dangerous territory," she commented, "questioning the entire ecosystem that pays our salaries." Reynolds nodded, acknowledging the truth. "I've built a career on confrontation, on creating viral moments that generate clicks and views. But last night something shifted." Elise studied him thoughtfully. "Because she didn't react as expected. Because I realized," he said slowly, "how rarely I actually listen to the people I'm questioning. How rarely I consider that they might be more complex than the caricatures I've accepted." Elise smiled. "Welcome to the wilderness. It's lonely out here, but the view is better." Across town, Charlotte Wilson was leading a tour of the Foundation's main facility for potential donors. The previous night's event had opened doors, created opportunities that might have remained closed. "The mentorship program Mrs. Trump mentioned," she explained, showing them a bright classroom where volunteers worked with children, "has improved graduate rates by over 40% in participating schools." One of the visitors, a wealthy tech entrepreneur, nodded appreciatively. "I saw the clips from last night, was impressed by how she handled herself, but more impressed by what she knew about your actual programs." Charlotte smiled. "That's because she's been involved long before cameras were present, learning about the work firsthand," another visitor asked. "Was the confrontation planned? It seemed almost too perfect." Charlotte shook her head. "Not at all. We were terrified when that question came, but her response reminded us all why we do this work." She gestured toward the children, focused on their projects. "It's not about politics, it's about them." As the day progressed, the story continued to evolve, but unlike most viral moments, it wasn't fading. As quickly as expected, something about the exchange had touched a nerve, revealed a hunger for discourse that acknowledged complexity rather than erasing it, for public figures who defied simple categorization, for media willing to reconsider their own assumptions. Reynolds finished his coffee, thanked Elise for the conversation, and headed toward the Foundation's youth center, not for another gotcha moment, not for another viral clip, but for something he had once valued before career advancement, before political positioning had taken precedence: the simple pursuit of truth in all its uncomfortable complexity. The studio lights dimmed, the audience slowly filtered out, some lingering, hoping to catch a final glimpse of the unexpected moment they had witnessed. The show had ended, but the story was just beginning. Backstage was electric. Producers huddled around monitors, watching social media explode in real time. "This is insane," one whispered, scrolling through her phone. "It's everywhere, and not just entertainment sites. Political blogs are picking it up too." The executive producer stood silent, arms crossed tight against her chest, her expression unreadable, watching as her carefully planned takedown transformed into something she never could have anticipated. In one corner, Reed's longtime director was already fielding calls from major news outlets seeking comment, context, anything to explain what viewers had just witnessed. Across the room, a network executive paced, phone pressed to his ear, alternating between nervous laughter and serious assurances to someone clearly higher up the chain. Yes, sir, I understand. No, we didn't plan this. Yes, it's authentic. That's why it's hitting so hard. Reed himself had disappeared into his private dressing room, the door firmly closed. A "do not disturb" sign hastily hung. For the first time in years, he had asked for complete privacy. No assistants, no producers, no media handlers, just silence. A moment to process what had happened to him out there. Carrie was in her own dressing room, graciously thanking the makeup artist, the production assistants, the staffers who orbit celebrities, usually invisible, but not to her. "You were incredible out there," a young assistant blurted, then blushed deeply, embarrassed by her unprofessional outburst. But Carrie just smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you to say," she replied, as if they were simply two women having a conversation, not a superstar and a starstruck employee. "I mean it," the assistant continued, finding courage in Carrie's gentle demeanor. "I've worked here 3 years, and I've never seen anything like that. He's never—" She stopped, catching herself, aware that criticizing the host to a guest was a fireable offense. Carrie touched her arm lightly. "Sometimes people surprise us when we give them the chance." The wisdom in her words carried more weight after what everyone had just witnessed. A production coordinator appeared at the door, knocking softly. "Ms. Underwood, there's been a change of plans." He looked nervous, papers clutched tightly in his hand. "Usually we have guests exit through the back to avoid the crowd, but there are hundreds of people gathered outside, asking to see you." He swallowed visibly. "Mr. Reed has actually requested if you'd be willing to join him for a few minutes with the fans." The request was unprecedented. Guests were typically whisked away, media interaction strictly controlled, a joint appearance completely unplanned. Carrie nodded without hesitation. "Of course." Outside the studio, the night air was cool, a welcome contrast to the heat of the stage lights. People lined the barriers, phones raised, voices calling out. But not with the usual celebrity chaos, something different, more respectful, more meaningful. Reed was already there, standing somewhat awkwardly, clearly outside his comfort zone. When he saw Carrie approach, something in his expression shifted. Relief, perhaps, or maybe just appreciation for her willingness to join him in this unplanned moment. "I thought we might say hello together," he said quietly as she reached his side. "It seemed right after what happened in there." Carrie smiled, understanding. "I think that's a wonderful idea." Together they approached the barrier, the crowd's energy palpable but positive, as cameras flashed and phones recorded, capturing something rare in modern media. An unscripted, genuine moment. A woman in her 50s pushed forward slightly. "I just want you both to know," she called out, her voice thick with emotion. "I came here tonight expecting a fight. I wanted to see my side win." She gestured vaguely toward Carrie, clearly identifying with her. "But what I saw instead made me remember what it feels like to actually listen to someone I thought I disagreed with." Next to her, a young man nodded, his appearance suggesting he occupied a different cultural space entirely. "Same here," he added. "I came to see Reed take down another conservative, but instead," he shrugged, almost embarrassed, "I kind of feel like we all won somehow." Reed stood silent, absorbing their words. A man who had built a career on performing outrage suddenly faced with the impact of authentic connection. Carrie moved along the line, greeting people, listening to their stories, not rushing, not performing, just present. One young woman held out a notebook, hands shaking slightly. "Could you sign this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "My sister and I, we don't agree on anything politically, but we both love your music and we both cried watching tonight's show." She gestured to another young woman standing a few feet away, looking equally moved. "It's the first time in years we felt the same way about something." Carrie took the notebook, signing it with care. "Music has always been a bridge," she said, handing it back. "Sometimes we just forget to listen for the harmony." Reed watched from a few feet away, witnessing the impact of genuine connection over performative conflict. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down, surprised. "Turn on CNN now," the text from his producer read, followed by another. "You're trending #1 worldwide." And another. "Every network is covering this." But for perhaps the first time in his career, the metrics didn't matter. The ratings seemed distant, unimportant compared to what was happening right here, right now, in front of him. Real people, sharing real moments, connecting across the divides that his show had so often exploited. A production assistant approached, whispering urgently, "Sir, we need to get you both back inside. The networks are requesting live interviews, statements. Everyone wants to know what happened in there." Reed looked at Carrie, who was still engaged with a group of fans, listening to their stories, responding with genuine interest. "Tell them we'll be available tomorrow," he said firmly. "Tonight's about this, these people, this moment." The assistant blinked, surprised, but nodded, rushing off to relay the message. Behind them, inside the studio building, executives and producers were already planning how to capitalize on what had happened, how to package it, market it, turn it into the next big media moment. But out here in the cool night air, something more important was happening, something real in an industry built on illusion. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Reed and Carrie found themselves standing alone for a moment, away from the cameras, away from the audience, just two people who had shared something unexpected. "I had an entire segment planned," Reed admitted, "questions designed to make you look intolerant, close-minded, out of touch." He shook his head, the admission clearly difficult for him. "I've been doing this for 12 years, and I've never scrapped a segment mid-show before." Carrie listened without judgment. "What changed your mind?" she asked simply. Reed considered the question. "Something you said about authenticity, about performance versus reality." He gestured vaguely, struggling to articulate the shift. "I just couldn't keep pretending that tearing people down was somehow making the world better." Carrie nodded, understanding. "The hardest conversations to have are sometimes the most important ones." Reed laughed softly. "My producer is currently deciding whether to fire me or nominate me for an Emmy." They both smiled at that. The absurdity of the industry they both navigated in different ways. "Whatever happens next," Carrie said, "you created a space tonight where people could hear each other, really hear each other. That matters." A car pulled up nearby, Carrie's ride ready to take her away. But before she turned to leave, she reached out, touching Reed's arm lightly. "Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just be honest about our questions instead of pretending we have all the answers." Reed nodded, absorbing her words. "Thank you," he said simply. No clever comeback, no witty retort, just genuine gratitude. As she walked toward her waiting car, Reed remained standing there, a man at a crossroads, the path ahead unclear, but somehow more meaningful than the road that had led him here. His phone continued to buzz, messages pouring in. Everyone wanted a piece of the moment, an explanation, a quote, a follow-up interview. But for now, he just stood there, watching as Carrie's car pulled away, contemplating what had just happened and what might come next. A production assistant approached tentatively. "Sir, the network president is on the line. He says it's urgent." Reed nodded, the real world rushing back in. He knew tomorrow would bring questions, scrutiny, analysis. The media machine would dissect every moment, every word, every look, trying to package something authentic into something consumable. But for tonight, for this moment, he had experienced something real, and no matter what came next, that couldn't be taken away. As he turned to head back inside, a text message appeared on his phone from an unknown number. "Thank you for listening. Carrie." 3 simple words, but they carried the weight of something profound, something transformative, something true. By morning, the interview had become more than just a viral moment. It was a cultural touchpoint, something people referenced, shared, and discussed in ways that transcended the usual celebrity news cycle. Major networks ran highlights. Political commentators weighed in. Social media feeds overflowed with clips, quotes, and reactions. But what made this different was how it crossed boundaries. Liberal outlets praised Carrie's grace under pressure. Conservative platforms celebrated her unwavering faith, but both sides acknowledged something deeper had occurred, something that challenged the very nature of public discourse. Reed woke to his phone buzzing incessantly, hundreds of notifications, texts, calls, emails, having turned it off the night before to process what had happened on his show. But now reality demanded attention. His executive producer had called 17 times. The network president 5. Even competitors were reaching out, offering exclusive interviews. The story had legs, but not the kind anyone had expected. He scrolled through headlines, his name paired with Carrie's everywhere. Marcus Reed and Carrie Underwood show America how to disagree. Unexpected moment of unity on late-night television. What Reed and Underwood can teach us about listening, and his personal favorite, from a major conservative outlet that had criticized him for years. Reed shows courage and vulnerability, a lesson for all media. Not a single headline mentioned winners or losers, takedowns or ownage. The usual vocabulary of conflict had been replaced by something more nuanced, more thoughtful. Across town, in her hotel suite, Carrie was experiencing something similar. Her publicist arrived early, armed with a thick folder of press clippings, interview requests, and statements to approve, exclaiming, "This is unprecedented. Everyone wants to talk to you, not just entertainment shows, but major news networks, political programs, even universities asking if you'd speak about civil discourse." But Carrie, sipping her morning tea, responded softly, "That's not why I went on the show. I was just there to be myself, to share my music, my faith." To which the publicist nodded quickly. Of course, but this opportunity is enormous. We could really capitalize on this moment." And Carrie, meeting her gaze, said gently but firmly, "I think that's exactly what we shouldn't do. The reason last night resonated is because it wasn't strategic. It wasn't packaging faith or values for public consumption. It was just real," causing the publicist to hesitate. "But your platform, your influence, it's expanded overnight." To which Carrie smiled and replied, "And the best way to honor that is to stay true to why it happened. I'll do select interviews, but not as a victory lap, not as someone who won a debate, only if the conversation can continue what began last night." Across the media landscape, something unusual was happening. The interview was being discussed not as entertainment, but as a case study in something society had been missing. What struck me, a prominent political analyst said on air, wasn't just what they said, but how they listened to each other. When was the last time we saw that on television? To which his co-panelist nodded. We've become so accustomed to people talking over each other, scoring points, performing outrage, that we've forgotten what real conversation looks like. In university classrooms, the clip was already being shown. Communication professors using it to illustrate effective dialogue. Conflict resolution experts pointing out how Carrie had de-escalated tension without sacrificing her position. "Notice how she never takes the bait," one professor told her students. "She responds to the underlying question, not the provocation wrapped around it." Meanwhile, at the network, an emergency meeting was underway. Executives, producers, and legal teams all trying to determine what this meant for the Marcus Reed show. "The numbers are beyond anything we've seen," the head of analytics reported. "Not just viewership, but engagement, shares, comments, follow-ups. And the demographic spread is unprecedented. We're reaching audiences who typically avoid our programming entirely," leading the network. President to lean forward. "So the question is, do we treat this as a one-off phenomenon, or do we pivot the entire show?" As Reed sat quietly at the end of the table, listening as others debated his future, his brand, his identity, until finally he cleared his throat, causing the room to fall silent. "If I may," he said, "for 10 years, I've built a career on being the smartest person in the room, on having the quickest comeback, the sharpest take. It made for good TV. It drove ratings, engagement, all the metrics we value." He paused, looking around at faces that had celebrated his most viral takedowns, his most provocative moments. "But last night, I experienced something different. Not just a good TV moment, but a genuinely meaningful exchange. And I can't go back to performing outrage just because it's good business." The silence that followed was heavy with implication, as the network president studied him. "What exactly are you proposing, Marcus?" To which Reed took a deep breath and replied, "A show that creates space for real conversation, that values listening as much as talking, that doesn't reduce complex issues to simplistic talking points or people to caricatures of their beliefs." To which a senior executive scoffed, "That sounds lovely, but conflict drives engagement, civility doesn't sell ads." And Reed, acknowledging the reality, nodded. Except last night proved that's not always true. Last night showed that authenticity, even uncomfortable authenticity, resonates in a way performative conflict doesn't, gesturing toward the analytics report. And the numbers back that up. Across town, Carrie was in a quiet studio, recording a short video message for her social media followers, not surrounded by the usual team of publicists, stylists, or media coaches. Just her faith, her words. I want to thank everyone for all the kind messages about last night, but this isn't about me or Marcus Reed, or who won a conversation. Her eyes clear, direct, honest. It's about remembering that, behind every opinion, every belief, every disagreement, are real people with real stories. And when we take time to listen, really listen, something beautiful happens. She touched the cross around her neck, no longer hidden beneath her collar. My faith teaches me that love matters more than winning, that understanding matters more than proving a point. And last night reminded me that sometimes the most powerful thing we can share with someone isn't our opinion, but our attention. And her words spread quickly, not with the usual celebrity viral speed, but with something deeper, more meaningful, people sharing it not to signal tribal affiliation, but because it spoke to a hunger for connection across divides. By mid-afternoon, something unexpected happened. Reed's publicist received a call from Carrie's team. A simple question. Would Reed be interested in a joint interview? Not to rehash the viral moment, but to continue the conversation they had begun, to model what respectful dialogue looks like even between people with different views, to which Reed didn't hesitate. Yes, the interview was scheduled, not on his show, not on any platform that either controlled, but on neutral ground, moderated by a respected journalist known for depth over drama. The news spread quickly, creating anticipation, not for conflict, but for connection. That evening, as Reed sat in his apartment, away from the noise, the hot takes, the analysis, his phone buzzed with a text from Carrie. Nervous about tomorrow? He smiled, typing back. Terrified. Much easier to argue than to listen. Her response came quickly. Truth is always harder than performance, but it's the only thing that really matters. He stared at those words from someone he had planned to ridicule just 24 hours earlier. Someone whose faith he had dismissed, whose values he had targeted. And yet, here she was, still extending grace, still choosing connection over combat. Reed set his phone down, walked to the window, looked out at the city lights, and for the first time in years, felt something that had been missing from his life, his work, his purpose, clarity. Not the clarity that comes from having all the answers, but the clarity that comes from being willing to ask better questions, to listen to the answers even when they challenge you, especially when they challenge you, because sometimes the most important conversations aren't the ones that confirm what we believe, but the ones that invite us to see beyond our own perspective, to recognize that even across the deepest divides, our shared humanity runs deeper still. The venue chosen for their joint interview was symbolic in its simplicity, not a flashy network studio with dramatic lighting and sleek furnishings, but a community theater in downtown Manhattan, intimate, neutral, unpretentious, a space where art and conversation had coexisted for decades. The audience was carefully selected, not the usual mix of fans and tourists eager for celebrity sightings, but a diverse cross-section: teachers, ministers, community organizers, students, activists, social workers, people committed to building bridges rather than fortifying walls. As Reed waited backstage, he could hear the soft murmur of voices, a different energy from his usual shows. No chants, no applause signs, no warm-up comedians priming the crowd for conflict and drama. Just people gathering with genuine curiosity about what might unfold. In a small room nearby, Carrie sat quietly, no entourage surrounding her, just a simple prayer, a moment of centering herself in what mattered most. When a production assistant appeared to let her know they were ready, she nodded, thanking the young woman by name. "Are you nervous?" the assistant blurted, then immediately blushed, embarrassed by her unprofessional question, but Carrie just smiled. "A little," she admitted. "The most important conversations are usually the ones that make us vulnerable." The assistant nodded, something in Carrie's words resonating with her own experience. "Well, everyone out there, they're really here to listen, not just watch, if that makes sense." Carrie's smile deepened. "That makes all the difference." The moderator, Emma Chen, was respected across political lines, known for her depth, her fairness, her commitment to substance over spectacle. As the lights dimmed, she walked onto the stage, no dramatic entrance, no flashy introduction, just a woman with a purpose. Good evening, her voice warm but measured. Tonight isn't about debate or discussion or even dialogue in the usual sense. She looked out at the attentive audience. It's about something we've nearly forgotten in our public discourse: the art of listening, of genuine curiosity, of being willing to sit with discomfort rather than rushing to comfortable conclusions. She gestured toward the side of the stage. Please welcome Carrie Underwood and Marcus Reed. The applause was respectful, appreciative, but subdued. Not the raucous greeting of entertainment, but the thoughtful welcome of engagement. They entered from opposite sides of the stage, meeting in the middle, shaking hands before taking seats arranged in a small semicircle. No desk between them, no physical barriers, just three people preparing for conversation. Thank you both for being here, Emma began. I think it's fair to say that what happened on your show, Marcus, has resonated beyond what anyone expected. Reed nodded. I think that's because it wasn't planned, it wasn't packaged, it was just real. He glanced at Carrie, a small smile of acknowledgement. And in media today, reality is actually pretty rare. Emma turned to Carrie. You went into that interview knowing the format of the show, knowing what typically happens to guests, especially those with conservative values. What made you say yes? Carrie considered the question. I believe in meeting people where they are, not just where I wish they would be. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying to every corner of the theater. And sometimes the most important conversations happen in the least comfortable places. Emma nodded. Marcus, I have to ask, what changed that night? You had a plan, a script essentially. What made you abandon it? Reed shifted slightly, the vulnerability still unfamiliar, but somehow necessary. I think I had a moment of clarity about the difference between performing and actually communicating. He looked out at the audience, making eye contact, nothing rehearsed in his expression. For years, I've built a career on creating moments that confirm what my audience already believes, that make them feel righteous in their opinions, intelligent in their judgments. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But somewhere along the way, I stopped actually listening to anyone who disagreed with me. They became props in a performance, not people with their own truths. A murmur ran through the audience, recognition perhaps of something many had experienced but few had articulated. Carrie, Emma continued, there's been some criticism that you were too nice, that you should have challenged Marcus more directly, called out his tactics. What do you say to that? Carrie smiled. The question clearly won. She'd anticipated, I think that criticism assumes the goal was to win an argument, to defeat someone, but that was never my intention. She adjusted slightly in her chair. My goal wasn't to change Marcus's mind. It was simply to speak my truth with as much grace and clarity as possible. She glanced at Reed, no triumph in her expression, just genuine warmth. What happened after that wasn't up to me. Emma nodded, turning back to Reed. Has this experience changed you? Professionally, personally? Reed didn't answer immediately. The old habit of quick responses replaced by something more thoughtful. I'm still figuring that out, he admitted. But I know I can't go back to treating complex issues like sporting events with winners and losers, teams to cheer for, teams to boo. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture uncharacteristically vulnerable. I built my brand on being right, on having the perfect takedown, the viral moment. But I'm starting to realize there's something more valuable than being right. What's that? Emma asked softly. Being honest, Reed replied, about what we know, what we don't know, what we fear, what we hope for. The audience was completely silent, absorbing his words. Carrie, Emma turned, your faith has always been central to your music, your message, but it's also often been used to create division in our culture. How do you navigate that tension? Carrie nodded, acknowledging the complexity. I think we've confused disagreement with disrespect, difference with division. Her fingers lightly touched the cross at her neck. My faith teaches me that love must come first, before judgment, before politics, even before being right. She gestured gently toward Reed. What happened on Marcus's show wasn't about finding perfect agreement. It was about finding common humanity despite our differences. Throughout the theater, people nodded, some wiping away tears, others simply listening with rare, undivided attention. The beautiful thing about truth, Carrie continued, is that it doesn't need defending. It just needs living, day by day, moment by moment, in how we treat each other, especially those we disagree with. Emma let the words hang in the air, giving them space to settle before asking her next question. Where do we go from here? Both of you individually, but also collectively, as a culture that seems to have forgotten how to talk to each other. Reed leaned forward. I've spent a decade perfecting the art of the takedown. I don't have easy answers for how to build up instead. He glanced at Carrie, then back to the audience. But I'm committed to trying, to creating spaces for conversation, not just conflict, for questions, not just conclusions. Carrie nodded. And I think that's all any of us can do. Take the next right step, speak truth with kindness, listen with genuine curiosity, and remember that behind every opinion, every belief, every position is a person with a story worth hearing. As the conversation continued, something remarkable happened, not just on stage but throughout the theater. People began to truly listen, not just waiting for their turn to speak, not just looking for points to refute, but absorbing, considering, allowing themselves to be changed, not in their core convictions perhaps, but in how they held them, how they expressed them, how they engaged with difference. By the time Emma brought the evening to a close, no one was checking their phones, no one was shifting impatiently, the usual restlessness of audiences replaced by a rare collective presence. I want to thank you both, Emma said simply, for reminding us what conversation, genuine conversation, can look like. The applause that followed wasn't the typical celebrity adulation. It was something deeper, more meaningful, recognition of something essential that had been demonstrated, not just discussed. As people filed out of the theater, conversations continued, strangers sharing perspectives, finding unexpected common ground, not in their conclusions, but in their shared humanity. Backstage, Reed and Carrie stood together, away from cameras and microphones, just two people who had experienced something neither had expected. Thank you, Reed said simply, for showing me a different way. Carrie shook her head gently. I think we showed each other, she replied. And maybe that's what we all need most, not winners and losers, just fellow travelers willing to walk together, even on different paths. As they parted ways that evening, neither knew exactly what would come next, how this moment would reshape their work, their purpose, their impact. But both understood something fundamental had shifted, not just in their public personas, but in their understanding of what truly matters in a world so often divided by the very conversations meant to bring us together. 3 months later, a different television studio, a different energy. Reed sat in a new chair on a redesigned set, the sleek, aggressive aesthetic of his former show replaced by something warmer, more inviting, a space designed for conversation, not confrontation. Today was the premiere of his new program, simply titled Common Ground. The network had been skeptical at first. Executives worried that civility wouldn't generate the same ratings as carefully orchestrated conflict. But the aftermath of that night with Carrie had proven something unexpected. Authenticity had power, a staying power that outrage lacked. The audience settled in their seats, not primed to cheer or boo, but encouraged to listen, to consider, to engage. As the floor director counted down, Reed took a deep breath, centering himself in this new purpose. The cameras rolled, the lights brightened, but no flashy graphics appeared, no dramatic music pounded. Just Reed looking directly into the camera, his expression open, genuine. Welcome to Common Ground, a space where we don't shy away from difficult topics, but approach them with something that's become rare in public conversation. Genuine curiosity. His voice had changed, not just in tone but in cadence, the rapid-fire delivery replaced by something more measured, more thoughtful. Tonight we're exploring faith in public life, not as a political wedge issue, but as a lived experience that shapes how millions of Americans view themselves and their world. He gestured toward the side of the stage. Please welcome our first guest, someone who helped inspire this show's creation, Carrie Underwood. The audience applauded warmly as Carrie walked onto the set, not with the cautious steps of someone entering hostile territory, but with the ease of someone arriving at a place of respect. They shook hands. A genuine smile passed between them before they took their seats. Carrie, Reed began, the last time we sat across from each other, something unexpected happened, something that changed the trajectory of both our careers in different ways. Looking back now, what do you think that moment revealed? Carrie considered the question, not rushing to a rehearsed answer. I think it revealed something simple but powerful, she said. that beneath all our labels, all our positions, all our differences, we share a hunger for authenticity, for connection across divides. Reed nodded. That night changed how I approach my work, but I'm curious. Did it change anything for you? Carrie smiled. It confirmed something I've always believed, that when we speak from the heart rather than from fear or anger, unexpected bridges appear. She adjusted slightly in her chair. But the real change has been in the conversations I've had since then, with people from all backgrounds, all beliefs, who saw that interview and realized disagreement doesn't have to mean division. Around the studio, cameras move silently, capturing not just words but expressions, genuine moments. The production team had been instructed to prioritize authenticity over perfection, substance over style, depth over drama. Your faith has always been central to your music, your message, Reed continued. But in our previous conversation, you mentioned something that struck me, the difference between defending truth and living it. Can you expand on that? Carrie nodded. I think we've confused winning arguments with changing hearts, persuasion with transformation. Her voice was clear, measured, carrying a quiet conviction. My faith teaches me that truth isn't just something we believe. It's something we embody in how we treat others, how we listen, how we extend grace, especially to those we disagree with. Reed listened, really listened, not just waiting for his chance to speak, not formulating his next question, but absorbing her words, letting them land. That perspective seems increasingly rare in public discourse, he observed. We've become so focused on proving our points, declaring our positions, that we've lost the art of true dialogue. Carrie agreed. And yet, I think most people, in their everyday lives, still value genuine connection, still want to understand, still believe different perspectives can coexist without combat. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on faith, politics, art, the role of music in bridging divides, the challenge of maintaining authenticity in an industry built on performance. Throughout, there was no attempt to score points, no gotcha moments, no efforts to corner or trap, just two people modeling what thoughtful engagement could look like. In the control room, executives watched the monitors, their initial skepticism fading as engagement metrics climbed, not with the spikes of controversy, but with the steady rise of sustained attention, real interest, deep engagement, the kind advertisers actually valued more than viral moments of conflict. We need to wrap up our time together, Reed said, eventually. But before we do, I want to ask you something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Carrie nodded, encouraging him. When we find ourselves on opposite sides of an issue with someone we respect, how do we maintain that connection without compromising our convictions? It was a genuine question, not a prompt for a soundbite, but a real inquiry from someone wrestling with the tensions of public discourse. Carrie considered thoughtfully. I think we start by remembering that our shared humanity runs deeper than our deepest disagreements. She adjusted slightly, leaning forward. And that sometimes the most important question isn't, am I right? But am I truly listening? Not just to respond, but to understand. Reed nodded, absorbing her words. There's wisdom in that approach, wisdom our culture desperately needs. The segment concluded not with dramatic music or flashy graphics, but with a simple acknowledgement of gratitude for the conversation. As the show continued, featuring voices from across the spectrum, religious leaders, community organizers, people rarely heard in mainstream media, the pattern remained the same. Deep listening, genuine curiosity, respect without a requirement for agreement. In the audience, something remarkable was happening. People weren't choosing sides, weren't mentally tallying points. They were engaging with ideas, considering perspectives, experiencing what public discourse could actually accomplish when winning wasn't the goal. After the show wrapped, Reed found Carrie backstage, away from cameras and microphones. "Thank you," he said simply, "for helping launch this new chapter." Carrie smiled warmly. The show feels like a natural extension of the conversation we started that night, a space where different voices can be heard with respect. Reed nodded. It's still a work in progress. I'm still learning, still making mistakes, still catching myself falling into old habits. That's the journey, Carrie responded. Not perfection, but intention. Not performance, but presence. As they parted ways, Reed was approached by his executive producer, The same woman who months earlier had orchestrated the attempted takedown, her expression now thoughtful, reflective. "The numbers are strong," she said, examining her tablet. "But more importantly, the engagement is different, deeper, more meaningful. People aren't just watching, they're listening." Reed smiled. That was the goal. Later that evening, in his apartment overlooking the city, Reed scrolled through responses to the show, not looking for validation, but for insight, for understanding. The comments were striking, not divided along political lines, but unified in appreciation for the space that had been created. "Never thought I'd see civil discourse on TV again. Watched with my teenager who has different views. First time we've been able to discuss issues without arguing. As a person of faith, I felt heard, not caricatured. As a secular person, I felt respected, not judged." The responses continued, page after page, not the usual tribal reactions, but something deeper, more substantial. Reed set his phone down, walked to the window, looked out at the city lights, and felt something he hadn't expected when this journey began. Purpose. Not the purpose that comes from having all the answers or winning all the arguments, but the purpose that comes from creating spaces where truth can be spoken, where stories can be shared, where bridges can be built. What had begun as an attempt to belittle someone's faith had become the catalyst for his own transformation, not just professionally, but personally. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in life aren't when we succeed at what we planned, but when we fail in ways that open doors to something far better than we ever imagined. What happened that night with Carrie wasn't just a viral moment. It was an invitation to remember what matters most in a world full of noise, to recognize that beneath our differences lies a shared humanity, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be heard, waiting to be understood. And in that understanding, perhaps, find common ground after all.